For only the third time in U.S. history, the House is poised to impeach a president.
That's right. The vote is expected on Wednesday, and lawmakers are planning for a trial in the Senate after that. House members would present their case, and senators would serve as the jury. Now, many lawmakers aren't even pretending they're going to keep an open mind. Republican Senator Mitch McConnell promises, quote, total coordination with the president's defense team, and Democratic leader Chuck Schumer wants witnesses to be called.
Everybody here is assuming that the House will, in fact, vote to impeach the president this week, which will set up the trial in January. NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson is on the line. Mara, good morning.
Hi, Steve.
Who is it that Schumer wants to hear?
Well, Chuck Schumer has asked for 4 witnesses who would have direct knowledge of what Trump said and did around the holding up of aid to Ukraine and the requests for investigation of the Bidens. And these are Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House chief of staff, John Bolton, the former national security advisor, and 2 other officials. Remember, Republicans complained that during the House Judiciary Committee hearings, there weren't enough witnesses that could testify with direct knowledge. And Democrats said, well, sure, that's because Trump refused to let any direct witnesses testify. He had a kind of blanket refusal to honor subpoenas for witnesses and documents. We don't know yet how Mitch McConnell will respond to this letter, but we do know that it seemed as though President Trump had been accepting the will of Senate Republicans that there be no witnesses. Mitch McConnell had once said that calling witnesses would be, quote, mutually assured destruction.
Oh, why would that be?
Well, because if for instance, the president wants Hunter Biden and Joe Biden to testify, well, then you have to get all these other witnesses, the ones that Chuck Schumer is requesting, and maybe the president doesn't want that.
It could be more than a little awkward for the president,
Yes.
who refused to send witnesses to the House,
Right.
saying it was an unfair partisan process, to refuse when the Chief Justice, John Roberts, is presiding over a trial in a Republican-controlled Senate.
Right.
Now, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, promised, quote, total coordination with the White House, which is an unusual thing, I suppose, to hear from a jury member. Another jury member, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, told CNN he's not trying to pretend to be a fair juror here. And just in case anybody missed him there, he said it again the next day on CBS. Let's listen.
But I think what's best for the country is to get this thing over with. I am clearly made up my mind. I'm not trying to hide the fact that I have disdain for the accusations in the process, so I don't need any witnesses.
Mara, is this unusual? Because Republicans have said all along, Democrats had their minds made up, have always been looking for impeachment. I think Lindsey Graham himself may have said that. Other Republicans certainly have. If that's unfair, why is it fair for them to say they're totally on the side of the president?
Well, I don't think neither side thinks anything is fair here. But even though senators do have to take an oath to give, quote, impartial justice when they are sworn in as jurors in a Senate trial, doesn't mean that an impeachment trial is going to be impartial. Senators who sit as a jury are not the same as a jury in a regular trial, because impeachment is a political exercise. And I think all Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell are doing is saying the quiet part out loud. You know, this isn't a jury in a murder trial. They don't get picked from a pool. And this is a political process, and that's what you just heard.
It brings to mind a bit of history that both other presidents to be impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, on the face of it, fairly obviously did the things they were accused of. But in both cases, enough senators decided it was not politically wise to remove them from office.
Right.
Mara, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That is NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson. Students in India are protesting a new citizenship law. This is what it sounded like last night in New Delhi when police stormed a campus, firing tear gas at protesters.
They're firing into the campus. See.
These protests started last week in northeast India, and then they've been spreading. The new law that Steve mentioned was passed last week, and it offers citizenship to undocumented migrants who enter India from 3 neighboring countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, but not if those migrants are Muslim.
NPR's Lauren Frere has been following this story from our bureau in Mumbai. Hi there, Lauren.
Hi, Steve.
Would you remind us again how this law is supposed to work? Does it specifically say no Muslims allowed?
So the law is an amnesty for undocumented migrants from those 3 countries that you mentioned. And to qualify for it, you have to have arrived in India before 2015, and you have to be a persecuted religious minority. So a Buddhist, a Christian, a Hindu, for example, and not a Muslim. And this was a key election promise by the Hindu nationalist government of India. And the government's reasoning goes something like this. Those 3 countries are Muslim majority countries where minority faiths might face discrimination, and so India should welcome those people.
Okay, on the face of it, that sounds like it would be reasonable, but clearly protesters see bias against Muslims here.
Yeah, they're protesting for a variety of reasons. In the diverse northeast of the country, people are worried that these new citizens will change the demographics, compete for their jobs. Some of the protests today on college campuses are in solidarity with the students in Delhi that you heard at the top of this segment got roughed up by police. But then many protesters are marching because they see this law as discriminatory against Muslims, because it excludes Muslims from this citizenship offer. And so this really goes to the heart of what India is. The Indian constitution defines this country as a secular democracy, but we have a Hindu nationalist government in power that's increasingly inserting religion into politics. In fact, last night we saw protesters carrying portraits of Mahatma Gandhi, India's freedom leader. And so the message there is this new law, to some, violates the values of secularism and equal rights that Gandhi stood for.
I want to pause to note something you just told us there, Lauren. Some people are upset because this law would exclude Muslims, but it sounds like other people are upset because anybody's getting citizenship at all, which is interesting to note. But this is something that is closely identified with the Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What does he say in defense of this law?
Well, he tweeted this morning that these protests are deeply distressing and that debate and dissent are of course, part of democracy. But he also made a comment at a rally last night. He accused his political rivals of arson. That was in reference to a bus that was set on fire in Delhi. But he also said that those behind the violence in these protests can, quote, be identified by their clothes. And that's a possible reference to Muslim attire. It might seem innocuous, but some people are calling that a dog whistle comment against Muslims. He could be suggesting that anyone in Muslim dress is suspicious. And you have to remember, India has one of the world's largest Muslim populations. We're talking about 180 million people. And many worry that Muslims in India are becoming second-class citizens under Modi's Hindu nationalist government.
Lauren, thanks for your insights. Always appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That's NPR's Lauren Frayer. History's longest ever United Nations climate conference ended yesterday with very little to show for it. Delegates from almost 200 nations postponed a decision on global carbon markets until next year.
One thing that became clear in this conference, if it wasn't clear already, is that there's a real disagreement between developed and emerging countries on what to do about climate change. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the outcome disappointing, and he referred to it as a missed opportunity.
Let's talk about this more with Kalina Orashikov, who joins us from Madrid via Skype. She is Politico Europe's climate, emissions, and energy reporter. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
So why was there no real deal here at all?
Well, as you already said before, it was a difficult COP. I mean, you were saying disappointment all around. I think one thing that it showed is, first of all, that tackling climate change and reducing emissions is a very difficult thing. And over the last 2 weeks, you could tell how countries were facing off with each other about how to do that and how much they want to be required to do that.
What is the divide that Noel just mentioned between developed and emerging countries? How is it that they see the world differently?
Well, we need to go back a bit about what the Paris Agreement really did. The Paris Agreement was meant to ensure that every country, not just the rich and industrialized nations, but every country would say, yes, we will do something to battle climate change. Now the challenge is, of course, that industrialized nations like the EU, the bloc, the European Union, as well as the US and others, they've been driving up emissions over the last decades. Now emerging economies, be that China, India, and others, they say, well, we're still growing, so let us grow and let us do our economic development and care for our people.
Oh, they're still saying, wait a minute, it's our turn to pollute. We get a turn to pollute just like you had.
No, not really, because they did agree to the Paris Agreement. So everybody said, yes, we have to fight climate change. But now the question is, who has to do more to fight it over the next years? And that's where the challenge comes in, because, of course, looking at the emissions data, many countries that will drive emissions in the future are emerging economies. And so now, just as we are on the eve of the Paris Agreement taking force in 2020, we see that battle playing out. And then, of course, global geopolitics and a very difficult international environment don't help, because the UN, after all, it's a club of countries. And so even in a climate conference, it's larger politics at play.
Of course, the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement and has taken a very different view of climate change, the reality of climate change under President Trump. How has that affected negotiations?
Well, you can feel that the U.S. is no longer there. As you will remember, the U.S. and China, that cooperation before the Paris Agreement was crucial. With the U.S. gone, at least like the big administration, the muscle being gone, you let countries that want to push back, they have much more space to maneuver and push back. And that's something you saw at this conference.
Kalina, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Politico Europe.
Boeing says it will temporarily suspend production of its troubled 737 MAX passenger jet beginning next month.
Yeah, all the MAX series aircraft have been grounded for the past 9 months. That already happened following 2 crashes that killed 346 people in Indonesia and Ethiopia.
And let's bring in NPR's David Shaper in Chicago, who's been following this story. Hi there, David.
Morning.
So what's the reasoning behind Boeing's decision here?
Well, Boeing was facing a couple of hard realities. First is that the Federal Aviation Administration, an agency once accused of being too cozy with Boeing, is now sternly warning Boeing CEO to stop with the unrealistic expectations for when this plane could be allowed back into service. The agency's safety experts will be taking all the time that they need to get their evaluation and analysis done right. And the FAA's head says he won't be rushed into making a decision. And I'm hearing that means that the plane will likely remain grounded until at least February or March. The second hard reality is that Boeing has been burning through cash at a rate of, according to some estimates, about $2 billion a month. The company did slow production a bit back in April, reducing the number of planes produced from 52 a month to 42. But it now has about 400 finished jets just sitting in storage, and it cannot deliver them to customers and get final payment. Richard Abalafia is an aerospace industry analyst for the Teal Group.
It's been really painful for Boeing. They've been maintaining production and not bringing in any revenue. This is very painful from a balance sheet perspective.
Okay, painful for the company. What about the people who work for the company? I mean, the 737 MAX is built at a plant outside Seattle. There are like 12,000 employees working there. Yeah. Are they going to be laid off, furloughed? What's going to happen?
Well, Boeing says no at this point. The company says it doesn't expect any layoffs for workers at this time anyway. The statement announcing the decision to suspend production says the company plans to have the affected workers continue 737-related work or be temporarily assigned to other plants in the area. But there is still a fair amount of anxiety in and around the plant. We had Ashley Gross of our member station KNKX ask around about the impact, and she talked to Veronica Medina, who with her family owns a Mexican restaurant called Toreros at a strip mall called The Landing across the street from the huge 737 plant in Renton.
Well, obviously being right here at the Landing, it's very significant. We get a lot of lunch crowds. We get, Renton in general, very dependent on Boeing's well-being.
Medina says that even if Boeing employees aren't laid off, if they aren't going in and out of that factory across the street, her business may suffer.
But, David, I mean, the reality here, there can be a ripple effect in the economy from a decision like this. I mean, there's a whole supply chain that feeds the production of the Boeing 737 MAX, right? I mean, could this have a big economic impact overall?
Yeah, this is where the shutdown could be felt more deeply, and it won't be so much in Seattle, but in places like Wichita, Kansas, where Boeing supplier Spirit Aerosystems makes the fuselage and other parts for the 737 MAX, and in Evandale, Ohio, where CFM International makes the engines for the planes. There are hundreds of companies that supply parts to the 737, and Boeing may do something to help soften the blow for them a little bit, but those companies still may be forced to lay off workers. Here again is Richard Abalafia of the Teal Group.
It depends how long it lasts. If we're talking about just a few weeks or a month or two, it's not going to be the end of the world. If this is a 3-month stoppage or conceivably even longer, yeah, the broader economy would very definitely feel some pain.
So a lot of question about timing here. And you said this could go like February, March, or does anyone really know?
or even longer. It all depends on when the plane is recertified by the FAA, and the FAA wants to work with its counterparts around the world to time the putting the plane back into service.
All right, big decision from Boeing, and our reporting this morning from NPR's David Shaper. David, thanks.
My pleasure.
All right, so there's border security funding. There is research to address gun violence, a 3.1% pay raise for people serving in the military and for federal workers. These are just a few of the items that make up this massive $1.3 trillion spending package that Congress has agreed to.
Lawmakers released details of the deal yesterday and are expected to vote on it today in the House. Both Democrats and Republicans are claiming victory after months of stalled negotiations.
And we have NPR congressional correspondent Kelsey Snell in our Washington, D.C. studio. Hey, Kelsey.
Good morning.
Okay, so impeachment seems to be dominating a lot of what's happening in Congress. But this bill that they agreed to is really important.
Yeah, it's actually two bills. It's two huge packages, and it's the result of months of work. It's based on a spending deal that you may remember that they struck way back in July. And this is actually kind of a really big deal because it would fund the government through the end of September next year. You know, it is one of Congress's core responsibilities to do this, but if you'll remember, they kind of have trouble with it year after year after year. This is more than 1,000 pages, and they're going through it really, really quickly. But if you talk to the Appropriations Committee Chairwoman Nita Lowey, she's kind of taking this all in the typical spending negotiator stride of saying it's just their job.
The Appropriations Committee is charged with one of Congress's most awesome responsibilities, the power of the purse. I'm proud that we have used that power to make investments that will give every American a better chance at a better life.
Now, it's important to remember that the House and Senate still have to pass this, and that's not always been easy in the past, but I'm assured that both sides think that they will be able to get it done. And this was negotiated with Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, and people in Congress tell me they believe they have the White House's blessing.
Okay, but there have been moments of surprise at the last minute, moments like this in recent years. But for the moment, at least, I mean, you have both parties declaring victory. So let's talk that through. Let's start with Democrats. What are they happy about in this?
Well, actually, I think it's important to look at some of these bipartisan things, one of which is raising the age for buying tobacco to 21. And that was negotiated by Democrats and Republicans, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Dick Durbin, one of the top Democrats in the Senate. And they're also repealing 3 taxes meant to support Obamacare, but have been widely panned by both parties. Democrats, though, are getting funding $25 million for gun violence research. And they're saying that it's the first time in 20 years that's happened. And they're also getting $425 million in election security and a big boost in funding for the EPA and opioid response.
Now, what are Republicans most excited about?
Republicans are celebrating the fact that they got $1.375 billion for border fence funding. That is pretty much even with the amount of money that they have right now. Plus, they get the flexibility to move money around for detention beds for a surge.
And then we've got another important vote this week, and that's an annual defense authorization bill, which is going to the Senate. What's happening there?
Yeah, this is a really big bill. Again, really massive, thousands of pages, and it has some major policy initiatives, including 12 weeks of paid parental leave, which is not necessarily something you'd expect to see in a defense bill, but it's something that both sides are really excited about.
Okay, NPR congressional correspondent Kelsey Snell covering a lot for us. Thank you, Kelsey.
You bet.
So we're learning more this morning about profits earned by the Sackler family from the sale of OxyContin. That's the controversial opioid drug marketed by their privately owned company, Purdue Pharma.
The company filed for bankruptcy earlier this year, as we've been reporting. But before bankruptcy, the Sacklers withdrew more than $12 billion into their personal accounts.
And let's bring in North Country Public Radio's Brian Mann, who follows opioid litigation for NPR. Hey there, Brian.
Good morning, David.
So it looks like OxyContin made the Sacklers very, very rich. Remind us just the context here. Why is that so controversial?
Well, it happened at a time when a lot of Americans were dying as the prescription opioid epidemic was going viral across the United States, ravaging communities. The company, of course, faces thousands of civil lawsuits tied to its alleged role spurring this addiction crisis. Legal blowback so big it forced the company into this bankruptcy. But as you've said, the Sacklers had already pocketed billions of dollars. And in the end, a lot of that money may not ever be forfeited as part of any settlement.
And what's new here is some details that we're learning from a new audit of the company. So what exactly is this?
Yeah, the data submitted to the bankruptcy court on Monday shows that in all, members of the family withdrew roughly $12.2 billion from their company. And a review by the New York Times found that this really accelerated. The Sacklers began pulling more and more cash out of the company beginning in 2008, hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Some of that went to pay taxes, but it also went into their personal trusts. And this is drawing particular scrutiny, David. Some of it went into offshore accounts.
Okay, so they have all this money, it seems. The family has offered to pay something like $3 billion of this personal wealth to settle opioid claims against Purdue Pharma, but state attorneys general are saying that's simply not enough. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. The Sacklers have consistently denied any wrongdoing, but they have offered this bankruptcy deal that would mean them paying out billions of dollars of their cash and giving up control of Purdue Pharma. As part of that, they've asked the bankruptcy court to essentially halt all personal lawsuits against them. They would be out of the opioid business, but still one of the richest families in the country because of OxyContin. And a coalition of states are pushing back. They're saying that the Sacklers should first give a full accounting of all their personal holdings, even stuff that's offshore in foreign accounts. And those attorneys general want to claw back more of that cash. And this audit is adding fuel to that argument. New York's Attorney General Letitia James issued a statement last night demanding more detailed financial records. She said she wants full transparency into their total assets.
Okay, and on its face, this doesn't look very good either. You have this other part of the bankruptcy process, Purdue Pharma's decision to pay out these big bonuses to executives in the company. I mean, what is the court saying about that? Are they going to allow that to happen?
They are. Judge Robert Drain agreed earlier this month to let the company pay roughly $35 million in bonuses this year to employees. The argument from Purdue Pharma that the court accepted is that key staff, people in the company needed to keep the firm operating during this turbulent time. Those folks just won't stay on if they're not well compensated. But of course, David, that money that's being paid out is money that will never be paid to victims or to communities.
Brian Mann covers opioid litigation for NPR. Brian, we appreciate it as always. Thanks a lot.
You bet.
Today, the House of Representatives will vote on whether to impeach President Trump.
So it's worth thinking back to when this all started. It began in July with a phone call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine. A whistleblower filed a complaint about that call. There were months of closed-door depositions. There were public hearings, reports. This process, no doubt, has been partisan. The facts are not really in dispute. President Trump asked Ukraine's leader to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden. What is in dispute is that impeachable.
And we should know more today. NPR congressional correspondent Kelsey Snell is on the line. Good morning, Kelsey.
Good morning.
So what are the mechanics of this vote today? How's it going to work?
Well, the day will begin at 9 a.m. here in Washington when the House comes into session for the day. We expect them to get started pretty soon after with debate on a procedural measure called a rule. And it is very much related to how the rest of the day will go. It's a kind of a necessary step before they can get to the final vote. The House Rules Committee kind of already established the parameters for how they would like the debate to go. But first, the House has to vote to make sure that those rules are established. Now, then they go on to debate. Now, I should say that vote should happen sometime in the late morning, and then they'll move on to debate for the actual articles of impeachment. They agreed last night in the Rules Committee to 6 hours of debate, but Republicans can still throw up some procedural roadblocks and delays. All in all, we expect this to wrap up sometime in the evening today.
Okay, so a lot of process there.
Yeah.
And worth noting that President Trump has said a lot about this process so far on Twitter, but he hadn't really been interacting with Democratic lawmakers in any real way. And then yesterday, he sent a letter to Nancy Pelosi, and it was remarkable.
It was 6 pages sent yesterday afternoon, and it was very much in Trump's own voice. There were capital letters and exclamation points. He called the entire process a coup. He called it unconstitutional and repeated that he doesn't believe that there were any crimes. He had said he wasn't going to get involved, and he says he won't watch. But it was very, very striking to see him respond to a process that he, by and large, has not engaged in directly. His lawyers have not engaged. They have said that they're waiting for the Senate trial, which they deem to be a fairer process. But this was a very clear and direct response to the vote that's coming today.
And directly addressed to Nancy Pelosi, what did she say about the letter?
Well, she sort of responded. She sent a letter to her own members following the letter from President Trump. And she never really references the letter from Trump, but clearly kind of has it in her mind. She says that Democrats should proceed in a manner worthy of our oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And she repeated a phrase that Trump himself criticized in his own letter, that she was approaching this prayerfully.
Today's vote is almost certainly going to set up a trial in the Senate, which, of course, is controlled by Republicans. What are senators saying?
Well, it kind of depends on who you ask. There are kind of two camps here. People who have decided that they are on Trump's side and people who say that they are impartial jurors. In the first camp, we have Senator Mitch McConnell, who was speaking to reporters yesterday.
I'm not an impartial juror. This is a political process. There's not anything judicial about it. Impeachment is a political decision. The House made a partisan political decision to impeach. I would anticipate we will have a largely partisan outcome in the Senate. I'm not impartial about this at all.
And then there are people like Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who told our own Mary Louise Kelly that she is going to be impartial. And that's something that we're going to have to watch as we go through who falls into what camp.
All right. Really interesting as we move forward. NPR's Kelsey Snell, thanks so much.
Thank you.
There is a secretive court in this country that oversees the collection of intelligence.
You say secretive, Noelle. It is normally secretive, but yesterday this court made an unusual move, issuing an order in public. It accused the FBI of misleading the court when it got approval for surveillance of a former Trump campaign advisor, Carter Page.
NPR Justice correspondent Ryan Lucas has been following this. Hey, Ryan.
Good morning.
All right, so what is this court that we're talking about?
So this is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. It's the court that has to sign off for the FBI to, in essence, wiretap people on U.S. soil, people who are suspected of being agents of a foreign power. And as you said, this is a very secretive court. It operates behind closed doors. It's incredibly rare to hear anything from it in the public. But clearly, in this case, the chief judge, Rosemary Collyer, felt compelled to speak out.
And what did she say exactly?
Well, she says that the FBI misled the court in its applications to conduct surveillance on that former Trump campaign advisor you mentioned, Carter Page. There were a number of significant errors in the applications. There were a number of omissions in the applications. And she says the court relies on the information provided by the government to make its decision in a case. The FBI has a duty to be upfront, to be forthcoming with the court. And in Page's case, she says, the FBI wasn't. And that could point to a broader problem. She says the frequency of the FBI's omissions and unsupported assertions raises questions about whether the FBI's information is reliable in other applications that the Bureau makes for this kind of surveillance before the court. So what is she doing? She says the government has to say what it has done so far and what it plans to do to ensure that this sort of thing does not happen again. And she's given them a deadline of January 10th. To do so.
To get it done. Okay. If we're talking about Carter Page, though, we're talking about something that happened like 3+ years ago. Why is this coming up now in such a big way?
So this is part of the fallout from the Justice Department Inspector General's big report last week on the early stages of the Russia investigation. And remember, a big part of that focused on the FBI's surveillance of Page. And the Inspector General found 17 significant errors or omissions in the FBI's applications for surveillance on Page. And a few days after that report came out, remember, the Senate Judiciary Committee had a hearing on it, and there was a lot of posturing on both sides of the aisle, but Republicans and Democrats did agree on one thing, and that's that there may be a need to look at possible changes to the process for getting court approval for foreign intelligence surveillance like they had on Page.
Right. You have people in the know now saying this surveillance process should be reformed. Is that likely to happen?
You know, it's hard to say right now. It is still very early in this. The Inspector General's report just came out last week. But certainly advocates for change are eager to seize on this opportunity. The American Civil Liberties Union, for example, said in a statement yesterday that Congress has to radically reform this whole process to increase accountability. They say that this process, as it is now, is really ripe for abuse. National security folks, though, say, look, this surveillance power is critical for the FBI in both counterintelligence and counterterrorism cases, not defending the errors that were made in the case of Carter Page. But the FBI director, Christopher Wray, has said he accepts the Inspector General's finding. The FBI has vowed to make sure that the sort of information that they are providing the court is accurate and complete going forward.
Okay. NPR's Ryan Lucas. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
So in Haiti today, things are looking up, at least for the moment.
That's right. We've been reporting over the past few months about these massive demonstrations that have paralyzed the Haitian economy, caused food shortages, even some deaths. Today, Port-au-Prince is almost back to normal.
And NPR's Carrie Kahn is there in the Haitian capital. Hi, Carrie.
Good morning, Noel.
So what have these protests been about?
People are upset here about corruption, specifically with regards to billions of dollars. Opponents of the current president, Jovenel Moïse, says were stolen, mismanaged, and just gone. That money was part of a low-interest program by Venezuela that provided oil to its ideological allies and to neighbors. And there's just no accounting for that money, and Haiti is unable to repay the billions now that it borrowed. And like David was saying, the president, he hiked the gas prices last year, which just set off this crisis, and it really intensified this fall and turned deadly with more than 40 people killed. Inflation is rising. Food and gas prices have just gone through the roof, and basic services have practically come to a halt here.
But today, things are calm. Does this mean the protesters have backed down?
No, not at all. They haven't given up. There still is no political resolution. But what we are seeing is there's definitely a drop-off in the size and the scope of the protests. Many Haitians here are tired of what they call pays lock, the lockdown on the country. And Haiti has long been, tumultuously politically and economically in dire straits. But this current crisis, longtime activists and analysts just say it's worse than they've ever seen. Schools are not operating very well. Hospitals, businesses have been shuttered or barely in business for months. And more than 3 million people are near starvation, according to international aid agencies.
People in Haiti really are training their anger on the president, Jovenel Moïse. How is he responding to the very real hardships that brought people out into the street in the first place?
He just consistently says he's done nothing wrong and he will not step down until his term is over in 2022. But this week, it's interesting. We've been seeing him making several public appearances, and he took some bold moves to break the stalemate, with regards to energy. Here, there's a big problem with blackouts and barely electricity 3 to 4 hours a day. And he sees the largest private electricity provider in the country. He says they owe him money, the government money. They say the government owes them money. And he, even over the weekend, moved to arrest some company officials. The head of the company is one of his biggest critics. And so here's Moïse yesterday standing in front of a huge public works equipment, just touting his plan to build the nation's roads. He's standing in front of this equipment and just saying, all of this equipment isn't to build roads to my house, but they are used to build roads to everyone's house. He's decrying corruption here. And he just keeps urging the people to be patient. However, that's what he's been saying since he took office in 2017, that fixing Haiti's problems will take time, and it's clearly patience has just run out.
Okay, NPR's Carrie Kahn in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, where for the moment, at least, protests have died down a bit. Carrie, thanks so much.
When the House began voting on articles of impeachment last night, President Trump was in Michigan.
He told supporters there they were in for the greatest speech you've ever heard. He attacked Hillary Clinton. He mocked the name of Pete Buttigieg. He urged security to get tougher on a protester. He said Fox News hosts praised him. He said women tell him dishwashers don't work as well as they used to. And he mentioned impeachment.
It doesn't really feel like we're being impeached. The country is doing better than ever before. We did nothing wrong. And we have tremendous support in the Republican Party like we've never had before.
The president was right about that Republican support. As he spoke, House Republicans were unanimously voting against impeachment, but Democrats prevailed. The House approved 2 articles of impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The alleged abuse is the president's effort to have Ukraine investigate political rivals. Here's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi after the floor vote.
December 18th, a great day for the Constitution of the United States. A sad one for America that the president's reckless activities necessitated our having to introduce articles of impeachment.
3 American presidents have now been impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump. NPR political reporter Tim Mack was covering the proceedings yesterday. Hi there, Tim.
Hey there.
What was it like watching it all?
So it was a long and momentous day. You could really feel the tension building over hours and hours of debate, which took some 12 hours from the start of the day to the end when we had votes. So as the day began, it was kind of almost a cozy winter scene in the House. There had been fires lit in the fireplaces of the Speaker's lobby right off the House floor. But in the morning, vocal protesters started to gather outside, urging impeachment and removal. And by the afternoon, it had become a pretty partisan scene in the House. Lawmakers were interrupting each other. Boos and jeers were heard on the House floor. And when it came down to the votes on impeachment, Republicans tried one last symbolic protest. They had wanted a roll call vote, that is, for all 400 plus lawmakers to have their name read out and to physically vote yea or nay. They couldn't get that done. So what they did instead as a kind of symbolic protest is that they voted manually with red paper ballots. They usually vote by electronic machine. So they signed these red paper ballots and they had the clerk tally their votes manually.
When the clerk tallied them, all Republicans went one way, nearly all Democrats the other. But who were the exceptions?
Well, there were two Democrats who voted against both articles of impeachment. Congressman Colin Peterson, who has been in the House for nearly 30 years, and Congressman Jeff Van Drew, who has indicated he will switch parties and become a Republican. Both come from districts that voted for Trump in 2016. So there's been a lot of talk about these moderate Democrats in these 31 districts that voted for Trump in 2016, then flipped to Democrat in the 2018 midterm. The vast majority of those Democrats in battleground districts decided to vote for the articles of impeachment.
Then there's Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who voted present. She's a presidential candidate. Nancy Pelosi made a decision after that vote not to send the articles of impeachment right over to the Senate. Let's listen to what she said.
We will make our decision as to when we're going to send it when we see what they're doing on the Senate side, but that's a decision that we will make jointly.
What's going on there, Tim?
They're depending on this idea that they have leverage over the parameters of the Senate trial. Those negotiations are still underway. They think that perhaps by withholding these articles, they can change the parameters and get a fairer trial in their view.
Would Republicans be upset if this impeachment trial were delayed in some way? Is that why they'd have leverage?
The whole strategy would depend on Republicans wanting a trial to happen and the president wanting some sort of vindication.
Well, we'll see what happens. Tim, thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Tim Mack. Given how vast the Democratic presidential field has been, a debate staged tonight in Los Angeles may seem comparatively empty.
That's right. Only 7 candidates will be there. Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Andrew Yang, and Tom Steyer. Hard to avoid talking about that big impeachment vote, but the candidates are eager to cover other topics.
NPR political reporter Juana Summers joins us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Fewest candidates we've seen in any debate so far. I suppose it's the way it's supposed to work, but what's changed here?
So the 7 candidates who will be on stage tonight have all participated in previous debates, but there have been a couple of big changes. Since the last debate, California Senator Kamala Harris dropped out. She had qualified to take the stage tonight. We also won't see New Jersey Senator Cory Booker or Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. And a couple of the later entrants to the race also did not make the cut. I'm, of course, talking about the former governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. There's one other big thing to note about this debate lineup. If you think back to July, Democrats had the most diverse debate stage in history. Now we're 5 months later, and all of the participants in the debate are white, except for Andrew Yang. Wow. That has renewed criticisms of the Democratic National Committee's debate qualifying process and the nominating process overall. Here's candidate Julian Castro. He did not make the cut for tonight's debate, and he spoke about this in Iowa earlier.
It's time for the Democratic Party to change the way that we do our presidential nominating process. Part of the reason for that is that I don't believe that the 2 states that begin the process, Iowa and New Hampshire, are reflective of the diversity of our country or of our party.
Democrats have been talking about this, the fact that those are fairly white states compared to the country as a whole. Are Democrats agreeing there is a problem, though?
So the Democratic National Committee and its chairman, Tom Perez, seem very clearly mindful of these critiques at a moment where race is at the forefront of this primary like never before. But they haven't said anything notable to suggest that they are either considering reassessing the order in which states vote or the calls from some, including the party's own candidates, that the debate threshold should be lowered for the debates that are coming in January and February.
Okay, so the debates have changed from a ridiculously huge number of candidates, too many even to fit in one debate, to a merely unwieldy and too large number of candidates. But 7, you can get a little better sense of them. What do you watch for?
Yeah, that's right. And so, of course, we're always going to be looking to center stage. So one of the biggest dynamics I am watching for is the dynamic between Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Over the last few weeks, they have been really targeting each other as Warren is looking to recapture the energy and excitement that made her a front runner in the late summer and early fall. And Buttigieg has risen to lead in the polls in Iowa. They've been talking about transparency a lot, as well as their respective healthcare plans.
Okay. Well, we'll be listening for all of that. Juana, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Juana Summers this morning. And let's move across to the United Kingdom now, where Queen Elizabeth gives a speech today.
Right. The speech was written for her by the new government following Prime Minister Boris Johnson's huge win last week in national elections. In the speech, she will lay out Johnson's agenda for the coming year.
To learn what that means for Brexit and the future of the UK, we turn to NPR's Frank Langford in London. Hi there, Frank.
Hey, good morning, Steve.
Hey, can you paint a picture for us here? The Queen, who's supposed to stay out of politics, is in politics in this moment.
Well, she is, but only in a sense, in that she's speaking for the government. This is just the tradition that every time you have a big election, you have a new parliament. The Queen comes over from Buckingham Palace, and she sits in the House of Lords, which is incredibly ornate, not like the House of Commons, which people might be familiar with seeing.
Yeah.
And then she reads the government's agenda. And it's usually filled with a lot of pomp and circumstance. I think because the turmoil in this country politically, there won't be as much of that this time around. For instance, she's coming over in a car, not in the carriage, which makes sense because we're kind of getting used to that here.
Also, the horses are getting tired from all the various elections you've probably had. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
But so this will be lower key. Well, the big thing that Boris Johnson is going to be talking about in this speech, which as the Queen gives it, is getting Brexit done, the same thing he ran on. He now has the votes, an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, to get his withdrawal agreement through by the end of January. The other thing that he's going to be talking about is giving more money to the National Health Service. The National Health Service here is really beleaguered. I think Americans can relate to this in the sense of concerns about healthcare and health services. And Johnson, even though a conservative government actually oversaw the decline in the National Health Service, he's going to talk about putting billions and billions more into it, which will be very popular.
And we would presume from the huge majority that Johnson's party just won that he's going to get what he wants out of Parliament. Does that mean he's going to prevail in everything that he wants?
He will. I mean, there could be some small changes to the withdrawal agreement, but this is a done deal. He has a huge majority. The bigger question is what happens next. And this is where I think that slogan, "Get Brexit Done," is pretty misleading in a sense, because he now has set a deadline for himself of 11 months to get a trade deal with the EU, perhaps even a comprehensive one. I don't know any trade expert who says that that's possible. It's way too complex. So we could either see one of two things. Either at the end of next year, a no-deal Brexit, which would cause a lot of economic damage, would be a stunning, frankly, political failure in a lot of ways, or a bare bones deal, which would actually cost the economy here. I was talking to economists yesterday, up to 6 percentage points over the next 8 to 10 years off of GDP. The idea that Brexit is over at the end of January is not the case at all.
I want to circle back to this formal moment of the Queen delivering the words of the government. I suppose that is meant to symbolize the unity, the continuity of the nation. But is the United Kingdom now united, and is it going to stay that way?
No, and what could be fascinating, Stephen, in the coming years is, does Brexit actually break up the union? Just this morning, Nicola Sturgeon, head of the Scottish National Party, they got a big win as well as just as Boris Johnson did last week. She wants a second referendum on independence for Scotland, and she says they're owed it because they did very well in the polls last week in the vote, and Johnson is going to say no. So it's fascinating that on this day you have a message of unity, and then up in Scotland you have a message, we want to vote to be able to leave.
Frank, thanks for your insights.
Happy to do it, Steve.
That's NPR.
Former National Security Advisor John Bolton has kept a low profile since President Trump fired him back in September. Now he is emerging in an interview on NPR.
Yeah, Bolton is a veteran diplomat, skilled in government, and viewed with alarm by some of his critics as a warmonger. But by the time he left office, Bolton was widely seen as fighting for more conventional policies than the president who tired of him. According to sworn testimony in the impeachment inquiry, John Bolton also had a view of the president's drive for investigations in Ukraine. His aides once included Fiona Hill.
I'd asked if there was anything that we could do about it, and Ambassador Bolton had looked pained, basically indicated with body language that there was nothing much that we could do about it. And he then, in the course of that discussion, said that Rudy Giuliani was a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up.
Now, Bolton still has had little to say about that episode. He declined to testify in Congress, of course, but he is offering his views on North Korea, and he did that, Steve, in an interview with you.
Yeah.
Why do you think he decided to give an interview after he has laid so low?
He clearly feels strongly about the way the United States is trying to approach a nuclear deal with North Korea. John Bolton had a little fight with the White House to recover control of his own Twitter feed. And once he did, a few days ago, he sent out a tweet that made it sound like he really disagreed with U.S. policy. So I called up and asked if he was willing to talk about it some more, and he agreed to do it.
Well, what did he say about North Korea? And is there a disagreement that emerged between him and the president?
Definitely. There's a specific objection and a broader one that John Bolton has. The specific objection that seems to have set him off, that seems to have bothered him, is that the Trump administration is widely believed to have quashed an effort by the United Nations to look into human rights in North Korea. Bolton thought there was no point in doing that. European allies wanted to do it. It was a way to interest people in pushing against the North Korean regime, which Bolton, as a hardliner, would like to do, and he did not like that the administration did that. He said it would be a big mistake to do that sort of thing. More broadly, he very flatly said that President Trump's effort to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons just isn't going to work. He didn't criticize the president by name, but he just said the entire enterprise is not possible. Let's listen.
I don't think North Korea will ever voluntarily give up nuclear weapons. It's been the pattern as we've watched it for over 3 decades now. The North Koreans are very happy to declare that they're going to give up their nuclear weapons program, particularly when it's in exchange for tangible economic benefits, but they never get around to doing it. And I think the inescapable conclusion is they're happy to sell that same bridge over and over again, but there's no serious chance they will ever voluntarily give it up.
Did you ask him, Steve, about this weird cryptic threat from the North Koreans about delivering a Christmas gift to the United States?
Yeah, the North Koreans have been issuing various kinds of threats. They set a deadline of the end of the year for the U.S. to give them a better nuclear deal or that they would return to a confrontation. Bolton essentially suggested ignoring that. He says it might be a bluff, and it's another example where he is a hardliner and clearly doesn't want to give much of anything to the North Koreans, doesn't think they'll give anything real back.
Sounds like he wanted to talk about North Korea, did not want to talk about impeachment. I mean, did you learn anything about his decision not to testify?
We put a couple of questions to him about that. His public position has been known up to now. He doesn't want to testify, and the way that he's termed it is he would rather leave it to the courts.
There's obviously a lot swirling around in that department, including some litigation that could affect my status. So I think, although I have a lot to say on the subject, the prudent course for me is just to decline to comment at this point.
There are other presidential aides who have gone into the court system because there is this dispute between the White House, who doesn't want anybody to testify, and Congress that wants people to testify. And Bolton essentially has said he would rather leave that up to the courts. Of course, some officials voluntarily stepped forward and testified. He doesn't want to, and he said very little on that subject when we questioned him about that in this interview.
All right, well, thanks for telling us about the interview, Steve.
Sure.
All right, so a day after an historic impeachment vote in the House, 7 leading Democratic presidential candidates met for another debate.
But instead of going after their newly impeached Republican rival, they sometimes turned their harshest words on each other.
Billionaires in wine caves should not pick the next president of the United States.
Mr. Mayor, your response. You know, according to Forbes magazine, I am literally the only person on this stage who's not a millionaire or a billionaire. So if this is important, This is the problem with issuing purity tests you cannot yourself pass.
That was South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg responding to Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. And
NPR's Scott Detrow was at that debate just south of Los Angeles, and he has joined me here in our studios in NPR West, where I'm usually alone. It's nice to have someone here with me, Scott.
It's exciting to be at NPR West.
So, billionaires in wine caves. Seems like that was a way to go after Pete Buttigieg. He became the center of attention, maybe not in a good way. What's driving these attacks on him?
Yeah, and I will also explain the wine caves reference in this answer, too. So a couple things. First, the fact is Buttigieg has been rising in the polls, particularly in Iowa and New Hampshire, and other candidates are viewing him as a threat, as someone who has a good chance of winning the Iowa caucuses in a couple months. He also seems to really get under the skin of other candidates in a way that other candidates on the stage have not. But this gets to a broader philosophical difference that's played out the whole campaign: how to approach fundraising. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren do not do high-dollar fundraisers at all. They point that out a lot. Their time is not for sale. Their access cannot be bought is the way that they frame it. Buttigieg does a lot of fundraisers, as do many other candidates, and a recent fundraiser that he held at a Napa winery in, yes, a fancy chandeliered wine cave with a lot of high-dollar donors is something their campaigns really pounced on as a symbol of him being a candidate focused on those contributors. Buttigieg and Joe Biden do a lot of fundraisers. Biden has allowed the press into every single one. Buttigieg did not until recently, when he was pressured to do that. His argument is that Democrats need to do everything they can to win elections, and yes, that includes raising money the traditional way candidates do for most races and for previous presidential races, and that is meeting with donors who can help fund their campaigns. And, he's benefited from raising a lot of money, running a lot of ads in Iowa, among other places.
If this becomes a focus, fundraising, could this hurt a candidate like Buttigieg? Could it help some of the other candidates?
He would probably be the candidate to come under the most scrutiny. You've seen this attack that you heard from Warren last night, that he's really catering to the high contributors. That's something he really pushes back on. But you were increasingly seeing, for most of this year, the candidates were really friendly with each other. They seem to generally get along. They agree on a lot of issues. As the voting gets closer, you're starting to see more and more one-on-one confrontations, really harsh differences being hashed out. And that's kind of unpredictable in such a large field. If candidate A and B really go at each other, who benefits from that? Often in cases like this, it's neither of the two candidates engaging.
Well, what does that change in tone tell us about the race at this moment?
It has been a really static race, big picture, over much of the year. And as candidates start to attack, I think you could maybe see the dynamics of this big field shift. I think one person who really didn't get into too many confrontations last night was Joe Biden. He had a pretty strong debate. Often he seemed a little shaky, a little out of the loop in these debates. He was really strong last night, making a clear argument for himself.
NPR's Scott Detrow talking to us about that debate last night in L.A. Scott, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move across the Pacific now to Australia, where bushfires are wreaking havoc along the country's east coast.
Since August, these fires have destroyed more than 800 homes and burned roughly 7.5 million acres. Jenny Webb, who had to evacuate her home, is staying at an evacuation center in the small town of Picton, southwest of Sydney.
It hasn't been confirmed, but my daughter thought that she saw our house burning on TV. So, yeah, a little bit devastated.
That was Jenny Webb. She was speaking with reporter Julia Holman from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And Julia joins us this morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on and reporting on this. Just listening to that woman there describe possibly her house burning and seeing it on TV. How bad is the situation right now along the east coast of Australia?
It's just horrendous here at the moment. New South Wales is an enormous state. It's bigger than the size of Texas. And the fires literally go from the top of the state right down to the bottom. These fires are also in very dense bushland. They cannot be put out by human effort. We're waiting for rain, but we're in the midst of the worst drought on record here in New South Wales. So there is no possible way that these fires can be put out, no matter the enormous human effort that is going into it. Overnight, 2 firefighters were killed when a tree fell on their truck and tipped it over. There have been a lot of firefighters who have been injured, and as you heard earlier, hundreds of homes destroyed. So this is a really desperate and worsening situation here in New South Wales.
How did these fires start?
I mean, fires are very common here in this part of the world. Fires start all the time from natural reasons, or, there are arsonists here like there are all over the world. The problem, though, is that it's so dry that we cannot put out these fires. And that is what is different this time around. As I've mentioned, the drought is so bad. It's been going on for years. The trees are like paper. There's one spark and they just go up, and they cannot be put out. There's so much bushland around, and that bushland is unfortunately very close to many homes and a lot of communities that are under threat as we speak.
Oh, so this could actually, this could really impact some pretty significant population centers. This is not just rural bushland.
No, just a few weeks ago, homes in Sydney were under threat from bushfires. These bushfires can also spread embers kilometres, miles and miles away from the fire front. So while the majority of fires are in areas that aren't the major cities, there's still large towns that are under threat. And just, being in Sydney, I'm currently in Sydney right now, but the smoke is so thick here. When the sun comes up, it's a bright red glowing colour. So, even in the middle of Sydney, we're still really feeling the effects of these bushfires.
And is the government, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his government, do they have the confidence from people that they're taking care of this in some way?
Look, they've already been criticised in the past for not linking these wildfires that we're seeing around the state to climate change. But there's been particular criticism for the Prime Minister because he spent the better part of the week in Hawaii on holidays, a huge error of judgment. He's currently on his way back to Australia. We're expecting him here tomorrow. But there's a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt from the communities that have been impacted so heavily by these bushfires.
Julia Holman with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation joining us on Skype from Sydney. Thanks for your
About 90 minutes after President Trump talked to Ukraine's president on July 25th of this year, a White House official was voicing concerns about military aid to Ukraine in an email.
Now, this sounds like something that we already know, but newly released emails give new details about the timing of this aid delay. That phone call, of course, is what led to a whistleblower complaint and eventually led to the president being impeached.
NPR White House correspondent Tamara Keith has been following all of this. She's on the line. Good morning, Tam.
Good morning.
Okay, so let's talk about these emails. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said yesterday that those emails, these newly released emails, are exactly why it's important to have White House witnesses in the Senate trial. Let's listen to him.
Until we hear from the witnesses, until we get the documents, the American people will correctly assume that those blocking their testimony were aiding and abetting a cover-up, plain and simple.
What do you know about those emails and the impact that they might have on this process?
Yeah, the emails were released through a Freedom of Information Act request, and they do fill in the timeline around the withholding of aid to Ukraine. And one email that is getting a lot of attention that you mentioned was from an Office of Management and Budget official to folks at the Pentagon about the hold on funds. He sent that email just 90 minutes after the president's now infamous phone call, and it includes the line, "Given the sensitive nature of this request, I appreciate your keeping that information closely held." In the email, he was talking about an ongoing review of funding to Ukraine and saying that they would be formalizing that within the day. That official who sent that email is one of four who Chuck Schumer wants to come testify before the Senate in the impeachment trial. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has made it clear he has absolutely no desire to call witnesses for that trial. For McConnell, he knows that if the vote were held right now, Trump would be acquitted. And he has said that he doesn't see his job as helping the Democrats make their case. This, of course, is one of several items at the heart of negotiations between the two leaders about how that trial will unfold.
Now, Tim, I know that you have been doing some reporting on how President Trump is reacting to impeachment, on whether or not he seems affected by this whole thing. What are you finding?
Impeachment is the ultimate form of censure, but for President Trump, there is very little indication that he's been chastened by last week's vote. He says he doesn't feel like he's been impeached, and he is just doing the Trump thing only more. So, he's always tweeted a lot, but now he is setting records for the numbers of tweets and retweets. And he's always delivered insult-laden rally speeches that lurch from one topic to the next and back again and include all kinds of random stuff. And he did that again. He held a rally on the very night that he was impeached, and it was his longest rally speech ever.
So one comparison we can try to draw here is with President Clinton, who was the most recent president to be impeached prior to President Trump. How did he handle this situation?
Yeah, so I actually went back and found audio of Bill Clinton on the day that he was impeached by the House. He had a bunch of Democrats over to the White House in the Rose Garden to show solidarity, and he delivered a speech that is just so vastly different from what President Trump delivered. It's truly remarkable.
I ask the American people to move with me, to go on from here, to rise above the rancor, to overcome the pain and division, to be a repairer of the breach, all of us.
Crazy Nancy Pelosi's House Democrats have branded themselves with an eternal mark of shame, and it really is. It's a disgrace.
They are obviously different presidents accused of different misdeeds, but Trump's strategy for survival all along has been about maintaining total Republican fidelity. And part of that is keeping his base along and not worrying about the rest of the country.
NPR's Tamara Keith. Tam, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right, in India, over the past 2 weeks, hundreds of thousands of people have been out in the streets protesting this new citizenship law.
That's right. So this law offers a path to citizenship for immigrants in the country illegally from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, but only if they are not Muslims. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is defending this bill. He says the demonstrators want to destroy India.
Washington Post India correspondent Neha Masi is in New Delhi. She's on the line via Skype. Good morning.
Hi.
All right, so you've been covering these protests since they started a few weeks ago. What are you seeing?
Right. So, as you said, thousands of protesters are out there every single day across India, from major cities like Delhi and Bombay to smaller towns in the south and western part of the country, everywhere really. And there are people from all faiths, there are people from all ages, people are bringing in their young kids, there are elderly people who have come out to say that they've not seen anything like this before, and they feel at this point the country is at a position where they have to come out and register their protest against what they view as a discriminatory citizenship law which discriminates against Muslims, and they've not stopped coming out. The authorities have, of course, tried to stem these protests by shutting down the internet, closing metro stations in Delhi, for instance, banned gatherings, but people are out there chanting slogans of freedom, reciting the national anthem. Over the weekend in Hyderabad, for instance, which is a city in the south of India, thousands of people gathered and read out the preamble of the Constitution in a bid to remind the government that the country is a secular nation and should not discriminate on the basis of religion in any which way.
You mentioned how the authorities are handling this. Around 24 people have been killed. Now, that is a death toll, and it's significant. It is not as high, I think, as some people might fear, given the sheer number of people out in the streets. If you characterize how law enforcement is handling this, are they doing it with restraint? How are they operating?
Right. So since the protests are widespread across the country, the response to these protests have been different by different states. And police action has also been significantly different. So, for instance, in Delhi, police stormed a university campus after a protest turned violent, fired tear gas into a library and assaulted students. In the southern state of Karnataka, police killed 2 people by firing at them. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, police have responded to protests by detaining nearly 5,000 people. So the police action has also spurred anger. However, there are many, many other places like Bombay, like Bangalore, where protests have been very, very peaceful. And these are thousands of people out there. So it's obviously a challenge to make sure that protests remain peaceful. And people say that they are committed to maintaining peace, but the police also have to ensure that they, exercise restraint. The police officials, of course, in these different states say that they've not used force unless there has been some form of provocation from the protesters.
Neha Masi, India correspondent for The Washington Post. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
200 bushfires are burning across Australia.
That's right. And people there are furious right now that their Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, decided to take a family vacation in the middle of this crisis. He has now come home.
I've obviously returned from leave, and I know that that has caused some great anxiety in Australia. And Jenny and I acknowledge that. If you had your time over again and you had the benefit of hindsight, then would have made different decisions.
Now, these bushfires in Australia have killed at least 9 people, and they've destroyed nearly 1,000 homes since September.
Julia Holman is a reporter with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and she is joining us via Skype from Sydney. Hey, Julia.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. We have been reporting on these fires for a couple days now. What are you seeing today?
Well, today the situation is, I would say there's a lull, but as you said, there's 200 fires burning. So that just shows you the scale of this tragedy when 200 fires is a relatively good day here. So there's fires burning. The weather conditions are calmer, but it's kind of the calm before the storm at the moment because these terrible catastrophic conditions are set to return within a week. So a lot of containment is happening at the moment.
What are the terrible catastrophic conditions expected to return? Is this weather?
Absolutely dire weather conditions, winds of, 60 miles an hour, temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that really that mean that firefighters just cannot fight these fires. The fires are huge. The area that's been burnt is 7.5 million acres. That's what's been burnt already, and the fires are still raging. So the area is just too large for firefighters with all their equipment to contain. So the catastrophic conditions just whip that up into a frenzy, and that's when homes and lives are really at risk.
Regarding the Prime Minister who came home, cut short his vacation, he must have been facing some serious complaints. Who was doing the complaining?
Just about everybody in the country, I would say, was complaining. He told people he'd made a promise to his daughters that he would take them on a holiday. And he does have a young family. But at the same time, the majority of the firefighters who are fighting these fires are volunteers. So they're breaking promises to their children. They're breaking promises to their partners. They're taking time unpaid from work to go out and fight fires. Many of them will be working on Christmas Day. So this is just not washing very well with the Australian public at all, that he's given this explanation, oh, sorry, I told my daughters I'd take them on a holiday. Whoops.
That's quite a whoops. Julia, just lastly, as you'd expect, some people are saying this is related to climate change. And I know that you've reported that Prime Minister Morrison has been a little bit cagey about whether or not that's the case, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt that climate change is contributing to the terrible conditions we're seeing. The Prime Minister, though, and many within his government have been less than forthcoming about that. In fact, many in his government deny links to climate change. So there's a huge amount of debate in this country. You think that the science is settled. The scientists are certainly settled about the debate. There is no debate in their mind at Australia's political level. And for many voters, there is debate.
Reporter Julia Holman with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Thanks, Julia. We appreciate it.